Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we have another great episode here for you. I'm joined with Dr. Gary Odell, who is a professor of geography at Morehead State, and we're going to talk about his new book, Bluegrass Paradise, Royal Springs and the Birth of Georgetown, Kentucky. Dr. Odell, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Oh, pretty good. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show today.
Well, thank you for joining us. Before we get too much into it, how about you give us a little bit about your Kentucky connection, your background, and so forth?
Well, I grew up in West Virginia and came to Kentucky when I was about 13 years old, moved into Lexington. And that's actually where my interest in springs developed, because we moved into a house at Cardinal Valley, and there was a large spring down in the valley below that. And I discovered that very quickly, kind of poking around the neighborhood, and it was literally a wilderness of greenery down in that valley. And so I spent a lot of hours. That's what is known as Preston's Cave Spring today. It's like a little city park. And that led me a little bit further afield to finding McClellan Spring. This was back in the late 1960s. And it was, pretty much a wilderness area. The spring itself looked nothing like it does today. The place where the water sinks was just full of old truck tires and wire fencing, and was quite a mess. Yeah. But it was a lot of fun for a adolescent boy to be poking around in that valley.
I can only imagine, because back when I grew up in Rockcastle, and we had a creek down by our house, and I mean, we played in that creek so much. I mean, it's its own jungle gym, to say it that way.
Absolutely, I felt like a young Daniel Boone, following those trails down through all those trees. It was so amazing, right in the heart of the city, all that greenery. You talked about these springs and stuff. So what drove you to write this book, I guess? What interests, I guess, and obviously geography is a big interest, but how did you get it started? Well, that's kind of a story that goes back a ways to when I was a teenager. I mentioned that I found that spring down there in Preston, Cardinal Valley, and that was the beginning of an obsession of mine, I suppose, with caves and springs. And of course, I'm sure your viewers know that Kentucky is famous for the number of its caves. We have the largest or longest cave in the world, at Mammoth Cave. But I just found that whole situation, the idea of water that would disappear underground and come out somewhere else, was just totally fascinating. And so I connected with the Bluegrass chapter of the National Speleological Society, that was the local caving club, and they took me on a lot of adventures to other parts of Kentucky to see some of the large caves and to be able to poke around and explore them. And I developed an interest in surveying caves, finding out where they went to. But as I grew a little older, my interests matured, I guess, and I started to become interested in the history behind some of these features. And springs, of course, are parts of cave systems. We may not be able to enter a particular spring and just explore the cave beyond it, but it's where the groundwater from these underwater systems comes out back to the surface. And so much of my caving adventures, when I was still a teenager, focused around the Lexington area and in the Bluegrass, because it was just simply more convenient for me to explore caves in that region. Yeah.
And Royal Spring, being the largest spring in central Kentucky, quite naturally drew my interest. And like I said, as I developed an interest in history, I found that it had a very long and rich history going all the way back to the late 18th century.
Hmm. Yeah. Whenever you're thinking about the springs, and this is what I found out while I was reading your book, and I really enjoyed this part of it, and the fact that you're a professor of geography, it all kind of clicks a little bit more. But like, oftentimes I read obviously a lot of Kentucky history books, and there's a lot about just different springs. But there's the Crab Orchard Springs back, hundred some years ago that was active. There was Dripping Springs a little further down that in Garrett County that still runs. Um, but like in your book, you really kind of go over the science of how it works. Um,
It's really a very simple process. Uh, Kentucky's bedrock is mostly limestone, and limestone is a type of rock that will dissolve when exposed to slightly acid water. And in the atmosphere, the water vapor combines with the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and that produces carbonic acid. It's a very mild acid, and in fact, if you drink a soft drink, you're drinking carbonic acid, so it's not
mhm.
harmful. Water everywhere contains carbonic acid in it. But as that rain falls to the surface, it percolates through the soil, picks up a little bit more carbon, becomes a little stronger, and once it hits the limestone bedrock beneath the soil, it follows the cracks and crevices downward and gradually enlarges them. And this is how cave systems come into being. The vertical and horizontal cracks are gradually enlarged, a process that can take tens of thousands of years. So we have a landscape that is full of sinkholes and sinking streams. And if you've driven anywhere through central Kentucky or over in the Mammoth Cave region, for example, you'll see lots of circular depressions in the landscape that collect rainwater and send them to these underground streams. And eventually that water, which follows these underground pathways or caves, will come out somewhere and discharge as a spring in the landscape. And that's how caves form. And Kentucky has literally thousands of caves across our landscape.
Mhm. That's pretty impressive. I don't know, like compared to other states or just other regions, Kentucky has more. I mean, is that pretty?
Well, we have probably there's 3 states in this area that probably have, or 3 or 4 states that have the most caves to be found anywhere in the United States, and that would be Kentucky and Tennessee, probably about equal numbers, and Missouri and Virginia. All of these areas have this limestone bedrock and numerous caves, large and small.
Okay. Well, that's a good hat to hang on our head. We have a lot of caves. That's good. um,
Well, like I said, we have the longest cave in the world, Mammoth Cave, which now
yeah.
has, I believe, over 350 miles that have been mapped in it.
Wow, that is a lot. Now you said you even surveyed caves, and that's one thing I've I'm interested in a lot of stuff, but I can't get my mind around the crawling through the narrow holes to survey a cave. I don't know if I could do it.
Well, it definitely would be hard on a person with claustrophobia. I've been in uh, passages where my back was pressed against the ceiling and my stomach against the floor. You just kind of wiggle along like an earthworm.
Oh, yeah. I don't think I could do that. I don't think it's which which going to Mammoth Cave is a good experience. Everybody should go check it out. But you don't get as tight in some of those areas that are open to the public. So
No, but when we're exploring a cave, people like me, we want to push it as far as we can, and so we press into every little crack and crevice that we can possibly fit into. And sometimes they'll open up and lead into great big passages, sometimes beautifully decorated.
yeah, wow. I mean, and that's the thing. If some of the caves underground or the caves are just beautiful. I've been to Saltpeter Cave there in Rockcastle.
Mhm.
Um, it's a real nice place. And to think, and I mean, this is a little bit off of Rural Springs in Georgetown, but they used to have church service, barn dances, and everything in some of these caves. So
Yes, actually, I'm working on a detailed history of Great Saltpeter Cave, which I hope when I'm finished that the University Press will be interested in publishing as well.
Yeah.
And, we just had, I'm a member of the board that helps to operate Great Saltpeter Cave,
Okay. Yeah.
nonprofit, and we have an open house every year,
Hmm.
and at Memorial Day, and we just this latest one we had, I think, on Saturday or Sunday, we had over 4,000 people show up.
Wow, that is awesome. Yeah, that's that was just a few weeks ago. But yeah, yeah, my mom, she taught at Mount Vernon Elementary, and she always took her students to the Saltpeter Cave and had a tour and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
it's an amazing cave with again a pretty rich history.
yeah, well, whenever you get that book ready to roll, or we have to have a podcast episode about it
Okay,
as
we
well.
got to.
Yeah. So let's go back to the Royal Springs a little bit, and like because in your book you talk a lot about this. You kind of really set up how and why it was important, and to McClellan Station, and so forth, and really what becomes Georgetown after the development and so forth. But just why was it such a unique place there?
Well, I think what the situation was is that when pioneers came into this country west of the Appalachians, they were looking for an opportunity to set up basically a family farm. They wanted to carve themselves out a place in the wilderness that they could call their own, but there were certain criteria that were necessary that for their success, and they were looking for fertile soils and a good water supply. Now, all through history, I mean, going back to the Greeks and Romans, even springs have been perceived as the purest form of water. That's not always the case, but that is the perception that people have. It's responsible for an entire bottled water industry.
Yeah, yeah.
But it would be safe to say that virtually every settlement that was made in Kentucky was chosen because there was a good spring at that location. And if you consider towns like Georgetown, Lexington, Danville, Lancaster, Versailles, all of these communities were founded at a spring because that was perceived as the best type of water supply to have. And in my book, it's not just the story of a spring, it's
Hmm.
the story of the settlement of the region.
Yeah.
And all these things that I was just referring to, uh, people came into this region because all the reports that were brought back by the explorers that came into Kentucky, the trappers, the hunters, the surveyors, all the backwoodsmen that came into Kentucky were so impressed once they got to the Bluegrass region with how beautiful it was, how fertile the soils appeared to be, the great abundance of wild game for the hunter,
Hmm.
that when they came back east after their journeys, they told their families, they told their friends, and so Kentucky had a reputation as being sort of a paradise on earth long before any significant amounts of settlers came here. But this is what drew them.
Hmm.
Back in the colonial uh, eastern colonies, there was not much good land available. The colonies had grown to a population of nearly a million inhabitants since the Pilgrims, basically, and good land had all been taken up. Much of the land, due to poor farming practices, had been exhausted of its fertility. The game had long since been driven off or hunted out of existence. And so people were looking for opportunities to start a new life in a new area. And Kentucky had such an appeal, spread by word of mouth and as time went on by numerous printed accounts that regale the reader with just how wonderful this land was, in the bluegrass area. And so they began to trickle in, and soon this trickle turned into a flood. And all these people were looking for just a patch of land that they could call their own. The system for claiming it was pretty complicated, but it was
Very.
possible. Yes, it was. But a lot of them didn't pay a lot of attention to that at first. They came in and they went looking for the right sort of land, the right sort of spring, something that would support their family, and started clearing off the trees and raising corn and building stockades for defense, protection against the threat of Indian attack, and built these stations all through the wilderness and a handful of public forts, which were pretty much staging points. Forts like
Yeah.
Boonesboro, Harrodsburg, and so on. These were staging points in which many of the settlers that came in first congregated, and once they got sort of acclimatized to the conditions in the region, then they struck out on their own and began to found their own settlements.
Yeah. Well, and the stations, and that's one thing. Now we think there's Fort Herod and there's Fort Boonesboro. There's Fort Logan now, or that they're in the process of rebuilding as well. But like there was a lot of stations all over the place. You kind of had, like you said, you have these um, families that start here and then they spread out, and that's kind of the way it went throughout the bluegrass, and more and more popped up. I looked at a map. It's been a while of Lincoln County, and there was about 10 to 15 different little stations or settlements in the area. So,
Well, there were hundreds of these settlements, literally. The pioneers that came in, they entered Kentucky through two main routes. Cumberland Gap, down in the southeastern part of the state, that was the land route. And then there was the water route, which was coming down the Ohio River from Fort Pitt, where Pittsburgh now stands. And they would uh, come to one of the landings along the Ohio River, or even come up the Kentucky River for a distance. And they found themselves with a handy network of trails that were already in existence. The bison or buffalo trails that had been created and maintained by the movements of large animals over thousands of years. The buffalo would go in search of salt licks, and there's all kinds of salt licks all over Kentucky. And, in searching for salt, they created these trails. And some of them were literally highways through the wilderness. They might be as much as 100 feet wide, created by the trampling hooves of thousands of bison moving from place to place. And so the settlers found this trail system, these natural road system through the region, and the buffalo would go from lick to lick, and the settlers would settle at the freshwater springs that they found along these routes. Salt also became very important to the settlers because it's a necessary condiment.
Mm-hmm.
And so they made salt by boiling down the saline waters from some of the springs in iron kettles and to supply the settlements.
Yeah. Well, like talked about many times, the resources are kind of the big thing. And like, if you're able to find a good spot of land with the resources you need, then that's kind of the way these stations all kind of cropped up and so forth. Now, um, I did a video a while back on the first settlements of Kentucky, and like the criteria of that was, there was a station or fort built there, and then a town built up around it.
Right.
Yeah, and so I had Harrodsburg first, Stanford second. I think Lexington was third, and then McClellan or Georgetown was fourth, and I believe Louisville was fifth. But your book focuses around the springs there, but Georgetown is a very important, one of the first establishments, or a very old city in
Mhm.
itself. And a lot to do with that was probably Elijah Craig and other stuff. But it's interesting when you start looking at how they kind of all cropped up there together. Louisville being a little bit of an outlier, but they were all relatively close.
Well, McClellan Station, which is the pioneer station that was founded at Royal Spring in Scott County, was not actually intended to be a town to begin with. It was a private settlement made by John McClellan and his family and a bunch of relatives and several friends who all decided to come together to Kentucky, and other family members followed them a little later. And he built a pretty substantial station. Uh, there's no actual dimensions or detailed descriptions that are made of it, but judging by the reports that something on the order of 25 to 30 families were living in the station, it had to be a pretty large one. And so
Yeah.
I'm guessing that it was probably over 100 feet long and maybe 50, 60 feet wide.
Mhm.
There were so a lot of people living in fairly crowded conditions. And the station did not survive terribly long. It was founded in the autumn of 1775. That was about a year after uh, Fort Herod, which was the first, and
Mhm.
a little bit, a few months after Boonesboro.
Mhm.
But the station came under attack in the following year. That 1775 was a pretty tranquil year as far as
Yeah.
uh, conflict with the Native Americans. But 1776, they began to make some raids and forays into Kentucky, and some of the settlements came under attack. And McClellan Station suffered an attack from a party of Wyandot Indians who came down the Bison Trail from the north and sort of caught the inhabitants by surprise. The first shot struck John McClellan and ended up being fatal. In a few days, he, did not die right away. But they took refuge in the stockade. The Indians slaughtered whatever livestock were around outside and set up in the woods around the fort or station, and just exchanging pot shots with the inhabitants. And after a couple of days of this, the leader of the Wyandots, a chief that was known in frontier parlance, he was called Chief Pluggy, but his actual name was Lakemanoti.
Mhm.
Anyway, he was killed by a bullet from the fort, and this so discouraged the Indians that they drug him away, abandoned the attack, and headed back up toward their villages on uh, the north side of the Ohio River. Well, this was just one of several attacks that were taking place in late 1776, and the occupants of McClellan Station decided that they were a little bit too exposed. I mean, they
Mhm.
were the only significant settlement that was on the north side of the Kentucky River at the time.
Yeah.
Everything else was on the south. And so they decided that it might be a good idea to just sort of pack up and abandon the fort. And so they took refuge down at Fort Herod, and Boonesboro, and Logan's. And in that same year, a good many settlers, because of all of the attacks that were going on, they thought maybe it would be a good idea to just abandon Kentucky altogether, at least for the time being, and come back when things were a little more settled and the hazard had been reduced.
Mhm.
So John McClellan died in the first week of January 1777. The station was abandoned and presumably was probably burned by the some Indian raiding party at some time. And that area lay abandoned for about the next 10 years
Mhm.
because Georgetown itself did not come into existence until 1787.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of a lot of well, that time period, 1777 is a rough time, and there's also the people in Fort Logan moved to Harrodsburg for a while too because it was just more fortified and they felt safer there, um,
Mhm.
and that's just the kind of the way it goes, with those sorts of um, during that time period, I guess is the best way to say it. So after that, though, you said 1787 is when Georgetown is formed. Um, and now, was it originally Georgetown though? What was it?
No, it actually had another name for about 2 years before it became Georgetown. Now, the founder of Georgetown was a man named Elijah Craig, and it might be worthwhile at this point. I don't know about you to talk about the discovery of Royal Spring to begin with, because we
Oh
kind of
yeah, yeah,
omitted that whole part to begin with.
yeah, yeah. Let's go
We
over
kind
that.
of jumped right into the settlement.
Yeah.
Well, in 1774, um, William Preston, who was the surveyor for Kentucky County, lived in Virginia, and there were a lot of what were called military warrants from the uh, French and Indian War, in which land grants had been made to men who had put in military service, and they were being allocated lands to the west of the mountains.
Mhm.
And of course, nobody knew anything about these lands yet, except for the reports that it was, such a wonderful place out there in the bluegrass and Kentucky in general. So William Preston sent his assistant, John Floyd, who was deputy surveyor for, I guess it was Fincastle County at the time,
Yeah.
into Kentucky with a party of about a dozen or so men to start laying out surveys that could be awarded to as land grants to these military veterans. So he came down the Ohio River and began surveying along in the general vicinity of Louisville to
Yeah.
begin with. And they gradually worked their way into the bluegrass. And a, uh, a man named Hanson kept a diary of the Floyd expedition. And as they came further and further into the bluegrass, the entries in Hanson's diary were just became more and more laudatory of the area. He said, the land we have passed through today is so much like paradise. It is so beautiful. Everywhere they went, they saw these, once they got into the Elkhorn Creek region, passing by the area of Frankfort and into Scott County, and just the fertility of the soils, the lush vegetation, the game that they saw, just as Daniel Boone had several years before. They were just so impressed by the area. So one can sort of reconstruct the movements of Floyd. He came up the Elkhorn Creek, and following, I believe it was North Elkhorn, a branch of Elkhorn Creek, they came to the Royal Spring Branch, which flows about a quarter mile or half a mile from the area of Georgetown to discharge into North Elkhorn. So they followed that branch. In fact, Floyd was looking for a spring. He wanted to find a nice big spring somewhere in that area that he could use as a basis for a land claim of his own.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these folks, these surveyors that came into Kentucky, were also going to claim land for themselves. I mean, who can blame them?
Yeah.
Well,
And they
they went
did
in
a
search.
lot.
Yes, they did. So Floyd and one of his companions went in search of a big spring, which they found, and they made camp there and laid out a survey of about 1,000 acres around the spring, which was later filed with the Virginia government and awarded to John Floyd. So Floyd went back to Virginia. This was a time when there was a little bit more Indian activity, and so they went back to Virginia, and he came back again a couple of years later, and maybe it was just the next year, but he found that in the meantime, somebody had settled at his spring, not knowing that it actually belonged to him.
Yeah.
And this was the John McClellan and his family. And so John Floyd, hearing that there were a bunch of people settled at his spring, he was just irate. He was incensed.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was going to drive these people away. But he got up there and he found that the McClellans, I guess, were very nice people. And they had John McClellan's wife was there and several small children. And just the presence of women on the frontier at that time was very unusual, let alone children.
Yeah.
And so his anger turned to sympathy, and so he made a bargain with McClellan that he would sell the property to McClellan for a reasonable price. And so
Mm-hmm.
both parties went away satisfied with
Mm-hmm.
the arrangement that had been made. Now, here's where we come back to Elijah Craig, the founder of Georgetown. Unfortunately, John McClellan was killed by the Indians before the deal could be recorded. And it went through several other transactions, and it turned out that for the next 3 transactions on that piece of property, either the seller was killed, John Floyd was killed by Indians,
Yep.
or the buyer was killed by Indians. And so it took a while to work through the courts as to who actually got the property.
Yeah.
But finally, Elijah Craig came into the country, and somehow he heard about Royal Spring. He came into Scott County, so I guess it was quite natural he would hear about Royal Spring. He founded a church at Great Crossings, and he made arrangements to purchase the Royal Spring property from the current owner. And this was in 1787, and he immediately began to make improvements. One of the first things he did was to lay out a school.
Mm-hmm.
And then he started laying out lots. He advertised in the Kentucky Gazette, the earliest paper west of the mountains, and the only one at the time in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And so he advertised in, I believe it was November of 1787, that he was laying out town lots, and these would be available for sale to all comers. And so the town of Lebanon was founded, not Georgetown,
Yep.
but Lebanon. Well, 2 years later, the inhabitants made an application to the Virginia government for a community to be chartered as a town, and they changed the name to Georgetown in honor of George Washington, and that is how Georgetown came into existence. First, a settlers' camp or a surveyor's camp back in 1774, and then a pioneer station the next year. And then finally, a decade after that, it became the town of Lebanon and then Georgetown.
There we go. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating to see how how it can develop over time, and things that could go on, and just how important and the whole point of the Royal Springs and how important that was, because that's to me that seems like that's the draw. It's like we're gonna build this around here because it's a good piece of land, a good resource, and so forth. We're going to pause right there with Gary Odell, the author of Bluegrass Paradise, Royal Springs, and the Birth of Georgetown, Kentucky. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.